Hello, and welcome to our next lecture. Today we're going to talk about the second branch of government, and that's going to be the executive branch, also known as the presidency. And we talked last time about Congress, the legislative branch. This is Congress was established by Article 1 of the Constitution. The presidency is established by Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, I want you to stop and think for a moment what it would be like to be president of the United States. I mean, the eyes of the world are on you. You'll be loved. You'll be hated. Of course, being popular or unpopular is not necessarily an indication of how you're going to be viewed historically. Abraham Lincoln, usually considered one of the greatest presidents in American history, was really only popular for the last few months of his presidency. Harry Truman was pretty unpopular when he was president, but is typically regarded pretty favorably now. So popularity or lack thereof doesn't necessarily translate into the history books. Of course, if you're president, you have Secret Service detail following you everywhere you go. You have no private life. Everything you do is under a microscope. You have to make life and death decisions every day. Do you want to bomb some terrorist organization somewhere, run the risk of hitting civilians? Do you need to send troops in, put their lives at risk? Decisions like this are things you have to do every day. So it is a difficult job. Would you like to be president? I usually ask my live classes this question, and I would say 95% of my students will say they would not want to be president. Only a very small number of people actually would. So personally, I don't think I would want to be president. Too much responsibility and too much on your conscience, I guess you could say. But it is an important job, obviously. And of course, if you're president, you're the most powerful single person in the world. When Truman, we mentioned before, became president, when Franklin Roosevelt died, Truman told reporters that the presidency, it felt like the moon, stars, and planets have fallen on me. Boys, if you ever pray for me now. Of course, public opinion, it can be a roller coaster as well. Most presidents are both popular and unpopular at different points in their presidency. I used President Obama's approval rating here as an example over his 8 years, since we're only about, as of this recording, a little over about 2.5 years into the Trump presidency. Probably when he's no longer in office, I'll update this for him. I'm just using the last president. But you can see Obama's inaugurated. Usually presidents have what are called a honeymoon period where their numbers are pretty high. This is shortly after their inauguration. So you can see Obama's here in the 60s for first few months. And then for most of the rest of his presidency, it's pretty close. He sort of seems to bottom out here around 2014, where his approval rating dropped to about 40%, and his disapproval rating was over 50%. When he left office in January of 2017, he had a disapproval rating of about 46% and an approval rating of 49%. So roughly 50-50, slightly more. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. He had an approval rate of 49% and a disapproval rate of 46%. So slightly more popular than unpopular, but roughly 50-50. If you want to serve as president, you have to, per the Constitution, meet a few qualifications. First, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. You have to be at least 35 years of age, and you have to be a resident of the United States for the previous 14 years when you run for president. So we got to talk about what this means. What does it mean to be a natural-born citizen? People often say you have to be born in the United States to serve as president. This is probably not true, actually, technically. Natural-born citizen means citizen from birth. So if you're born in the United States, typically, yes, you are automatically a U.S. citizen. If you're born abroad in a foreign country, you can still be a natural-born citizen if at least one of your parents is a U.S. citizen, because citizenship is also inherited. So Ted Cruz, for example, was a presidential candidate in 2016. He was born in Canada, but he's eligible because his parents were U.S. citizens. Or George Romney, back in '68, I believe, was a candidate that was born in Mexico, but his parents were both citizens, so he inherited their citizenship. The 12th Amendment states that the vice president must meet the same qualifications as president and more or less can't be from the same state as the president. It doesn't exactly say that. What it says is that electors, the Electoral College, can not cast their votes for president or vice president to two individuals from the same state they're from. So what this effectively means is that if you had a president and vice presidential candidate both from Texas, Texas's electors at the Electoral College could not cast their votes for one of the two candidates. They can only vote for one of them. So what this means in practice is that the president and VP are not going to be from the same state. The 22nd Amendment, which was passed and ratified in 1951, created term limits. And you can only serve as president for 2 terms or 10 years. I think we may have mentioned this earlier in the semester, but the 10 years thing is so that if a vice president becomes president with 2 years or less remaining in a presidential term, they can run for 2 terms of their own. If they become president with more than 2 years left, they can only run for 1 term of their own. Lyndon Johnson started to run, but became president in November 1963, so when Kennedy was assassinated, he had a little over a year left of Kennedy's term that he served. Then he went on to serve as, he served president for 1 year, a little over a year. Then he was elected to his own full term in 64. He could have been elected to a second full term in 68, which would have meant he would have served a little over 9 years as president. It ended up not happening, but he could have. All right, so line of succession. Something happens to the president, the VP becomes president, the vice president. After the vice president, the Speaker of the House, then the President pro tempore of the Senate, then the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. So there you are. And you probably know all these people are never in the same place at one time. The closest they come would be during the State of the Union address. But there's always someone who is not present during the State of the Union address. This is to keep the line of succession in place should something happen. So usually there's one member of the line of succession that's said shortly after 9/11 of the vice president, he or she's in a secure, undisclosed location, in a bunker somewhere, most likely. So, yeah. And you may wonder why these positions are ranked as they are. Like you might think, for instance, the Secretary of Homeland Security should come before, say, the Secretary of Energy. The reason they're in this line is because this is the order in which these departments were established. And Homeland Security is the most recently established cabinet post, established in 2003 in response to the 9/11 attacks. So that's why it's last. The second most recent one would be the Department of Veterans Affairs. I believe it was established in 1989. So it's not really like a judgment of the importance of these cabinet positions. It's just the order in which they were created. All right, if you do want to become president, there is no clear career track you can take. There's no path to the presidency. You look at some examples in history. There have been some presidents who've never held political or elected or government offices before. I think Trump is the only president in American history to have never held any kind of public office before or been a member of the military. So he's sort of unique in that regard. There have been, I think, 3 other presidents who've never held elected office before: Dwight Eisenhower and Ulysses Grant, who were both generals, and Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of State. So there's also, if you look at some of the more recent presidents, Barack Obama had served as a state senator, then a U.S. senator, then he became president. George W. Bush had been a businessman, then served as governor of Texas, then became president. Ronald Reagan had been an actor, then he served as governor, then he became president. So there's lots of different ways you can become president. The most common pathway, though, is the vice presidency or being governor of a state, preferably a big state and or a swing state. So if you look at George W. Bush, before he was president, he was governor of Texas. Bill Clinton, before he was president, he was governor of Arkansas. George H.W. Bush, before he was president, he was vice president under Reagan. Reagan, before he was president, he was governor of California. Carter, before he was president, he was governor of Georgia. Ford, before he was president, he was vice president under Nixon. Nixon had been vice president under Eisenhower. So, VP or governor is your best route if you want to become president. The vice presidency is a little bit risky, though, because you're hitching your wagon to someone else's star. Mike Pence, who's the current vice president, I suspect he will probably run for president in 2024. Obviously, I don't know yet what's going to happen in 2020, but regardless of whether Trump wins or loses, Trump will not be probably running in 2024, so Pence will run then, I think. And of course, again, George H.W. Bush had been president of Reagan for 8 years before he was elected in 88. He ran on Reagan's coattails, essentially. If you liked Reagan, then you voted for George H.W. Bush because he was sort of a continuation of that. So if the president you're vice president under is popular, this helps you. If the president you're VP under is unpopular, then this hurts you. So we'll see how. So Pence's prospects are greatly tied probably to how popular Trump is when he leaves office. Governorships are another common way too. Members of Congress, fairly rare actually. Barack Obama had been a senator, been elected from the U.S. Senate to the presidency, but he was the first president elected from the U.S. Senate, directly from the U.S. Senate, I should say, since John F. Kennedy. So it's not particularly common that a member of Congress gets elected president. In all of U.S. history, there's only been, the most recent example of a member of the House being elected president directly from the House would have been James A. Garfield back in 1880. So if you want to become president, probably going into Congress is not your best path. Your best bet is to become governor of a significant state. Now, you want to be president, your life is going to be pretty difficult because presidency is a burden and there's a lot of different things you're expected to do, more things than you can possibly do. You have all these different roles. You're the chief executive, chief diplomat, chief legislature, and voice of the people. All right, as chief executive, you essentially serve as CEO of the United States, and you get paid. You get paid $400,000 a year, plus $50,000 in non-taxable expenses, up to $100,000 to cover travel, and $19,000 for... sorry about that. Pollen in the air, I think. So, you're paid. So, the pay looks pretty good. I think the last time the president got a raise was 2001. Now, yeah, the pay's good, but it's not... CEO of a large company makes a whole lot more money than this. So, while the pay sounds good, when you consider what the job is, it's not so great pay. The president leads the biggest corporation in the United States. All federal laws pass his or her desk. The president has a staff of about 1,000 people who work for the president. This does not count cabinet employees. The president has to deal with bureaucracy, which can be slow to work and can slow the president down when fast reactions are needed. Like, for example, after 9/11 or after Hurricane Katrina or after the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. So bureaucracy can slow things down for the president. One of the areas where the president probably has the most power comes with foreign policy. President is chief diplomat. They have quite a bit of power when it comes to foreign policy. They can enter into executive agreements, which don't require Senate approval. Difference in a treaty and an executive agreement is that a treaty requires a 2/3 vote by the Senate and has the force of law, whereas an executive agreement only requires agreement of the president and his foreign counterpart, the leader of the country that we're entering into the executive agreement with. They don't require Senate approval. On the other hand, executive agreements can be withdrawn from at any time, whereas a treaty requires the Senate vote to change. The president has the authority to recognize or not recognize foreign governments. Right now, Trump has recognized the opposition leader in Venezuela as the actual leader of Venezuela instead of Maduro, who's sort of the strongman / dictator ruler there. Of course, this gives the opposition a pretty big boost to have credibility to be recognized by the most powerful country in the world. Foreign policy is almost completely controlled by the president. Domestic affairs, different story though. I mean, we talked about this before, but Congress, as intended by the founders and laid out in the Constitution, is the more powerful branch of government, more powerful than the presidency. The Constitution, the president has the power to propose laws, but he can only do this. He can't directly propose a law. He has to get a member of Congress to propose one on his behalf. And ability to get them passed, of course, depends on Congress, who controls Congress. As president, according to the Constitution, is required to, from time to time, give information on the State of the Union, which is the basis for the State of the Union address, which happens every year in January. The Constitution requires that the president give information on the State of the Union, but doesn't specify how often it has to be. It just says from time to time. Every year has sort of just become the accepted time frame. Also, the Constitution doesn't require that the State of the Union be a speech. It has been since, I think, 1913, and George Washington and John Adams gave speeches for the State of the Union address in their presidency, but Thomas Jefferson, the third president, beginning in 1801, didn't like to give speeches, so he wrote up a written statement and submitted it to Congress as the State of the Union. And every president from Jefferson up to Taft continued to do this. So every president from Jefferson to Taft simply wrote up a statement and submitted to Congress for State of the Union. They didn't give a speech. Wilson realized that it could be politically advantageous to give a speech. Also, radio was becoming a thing at that point, so people at home could listen live. So he decided to revert back and start giving speeches, and every president since then has done so. Executive privilege. The presidency claims the inherent right to withhold information from Congress and the courts. And right now, Trump is actually claiming executive privilege. There's nothing specifically in the Constitution which creates executive privilege. It's more theoretical than concrete. The idea, though, is that because of separation of powers, we have three branches of government. There are certain areas where one branch can't encroach on another branch's authority because that creates a situation where one branch becomes too powerful. So if you accept this premise, then it may be allowed that branches can keep information from other branches. And that's the idea that executive privilege is based on. Now, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's all you can really say. When executive privilege is claimed, Congress will usually issue a subpoena. If the president refuses to follow it, then lawsuits ensue, and ultimately the courts can decide whether or not the executive branch is required to hand over this information. Most famously, Nixon used the concept of executive privilege to try to keep from handing over the Watergate tapes, but ultimately the courts ruled against him and he was forced to turn them over. The president also has what's called a pocket veto. So this is also something that's not explicitly in the Constitution, but has become an accepted thing. The first president to use it was Madison in 1812, so over 200 years. But here's how it works. You probably know a bill passes Congress, it lands on the president's desk. The president can either sign it or veto it. If the president does nothing and takes no action, in other words, neither signs nor vetoes it, after 10 days, not counting Sundays, the bill becomes law by default without the president's signature. So there is an exception to this, though. If Congress adjourns before the 10-day period has passed, and the president has not signed the bill, then the bill does not become law. Effectively, it's vetoed. And since Congress is adjourned, they cannot attempt to override it. So effectively, this is what's called a pocket veto, because the president folds the bill up and puts it in his pocket. This is also a little legally murky, like I said, but it goes all the way back to 1812, so probably we're not going to get rid of this. This is why Congress, if they suspect the president might veto something, will typically not adjourn until the 10-day period is over. President also for 2 years had what was called the line item veto. This meant the president can go through a bill that's passed Congress and line by line and take out the parts they don't like and then sign the bill, and what they took out does not become law, but what they left in does become law. The idea behind this was it was going to get rid of pork expenditures, earmarks, things like that. But the Supreme Court struck it down in 1998, ruled that this was giving too much power to the president, to the executive branch. Most governors, by the way, still have this power. But as it is now, when a bill lands on the president's desk, he either signs it and it all becomes law, or he vetoes it and none of it becomes law. Line item veto was designed to deal with riders, which is legislation attached to unrelated legislation. So the Defense Appropriations Bill, for example, which funds the military. You might, if you want a bridge built in your district back home, you might attach an amendment providing for that. If we have a line item veto, the president can simply draw a line through that and it doesn't become law. But these days, he can't anymore. Either when he signs the bill, it becomes law, or he vetoes it and none of it does. All right, president's popular leader, in theory at least, speaks for all Americans. Now, do you think that we have unrealistic expectations of our president? I mean, you look at any election campaign, and the candidates all go around promising they're going to do all these great things, get the economy moving again, create jobs, cut taxes, protect Social Security, improve education, improve health care, blah, 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 blah. They promise they're going to do all this stuff. Do they ever actually do everything they promise? The answer is no, because it's not possible. But in fairness to presidential candidates, this is more or less what they have to do if they want to get elected. Do you think if I ran for president and I went around and gave a campaign speech in which I said, yep, we're going to work hard to get the economy moving again, but I can't make any guarantees. We're in a globalized economy now, and most of what goes on in the economy is beyond the control of the president. So I can't make any promises, but I'll do the best I can. Probably not going to win with that, right? Even though that's honest. So, yes, when they run for office, candidates lie to us, but we apparently want them to lie to us. If someone is honest, then they typically aren't going to get elected. All right, so the powers of the presidency have expanded greatly since the Constitution was written. You may have heard the story that they offered to make George Washington king, and he refused because he didn't believe that a republic should have a monarch. Probably not true. There were some people that would have been willing to make Washington a king, but by and large, it was attendees at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia have said, we never once thought of a king. There was disagreement on how powerful the president should be. People like Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Madison favored a stronger executive, whereas people like Thomas Jefferson favored a weaker executive. And ultimately, these disagreements is ultimately how we ended up with the presidency that we have. And over time, the presidential powers have grown significantly. I mentioned some key presidents from the late 18th century up until the early to mid 20th century: Washington, Jackson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. All of these presidents had some power in expanding the powers of the presidency. George Washington's the first. He set the tone. The Constitution mentions that the president should have a cabinet, but doesn't mention what this cabinet should consist of. So Washington just pretty much had to make it up. So he appointed a Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Attorney General, Secretary of the Treasury, and a Postmaster General. And those were his 5 cabinet posts. And all those, except for Postmaster General, are still cabinet posts. Secretary of War is now the Secretary of Defense, but tomato, tomato. Andrew Jackson, as president, stared down South Carolina when they threatened to secede and threatened to nullify one of the bills that he signed into law during the nullification crisis, which increased the power of the federal government and of the presidency. He also was the first president to use the political veto. And what's the political veto? Before Andrew Jackson, presidents typically only vetoed laws if they believed they were unconstitutional. So if they didn't like a law that Congress passed, they would still sign it into law unless they thought it was unconstitutional, because their view was it's Congress's job to make the laws, not the president's, which is true, actually. But Jackson changed that. He said, screw that, I'm going to veto any bill that I don't like. And every president since then has followed suit, and we pretty much take it for granted that the president can do that. During the Civil War and lead up to it, Abraham Lincoln, we talked about earlier, used some pretty heavy-handed tactics to deal with dissent, had newspapers shut down, had Confederate sympathizers arrested and thrown in jail, left there for months or years. Teddy Roosevelt as president, he was the first president to intervene in a labor dispute. When coal miners went on strike, he stepped in and served as mediator for them, and mediated a dispute between them and the mine owners. Nothing in the Constitution says the president can do this, but he did. His argument was that at the time, most of our homes were heated by coal, and winter is coming, so this is effectively a national security issue. Woodrow Wilson, with greater foreign policy, Franklin Roosevelt through the New Deal and through court packing. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a little while. Another thing in the 20th century which increased the powers of the presidency had been the Cold War and foreign affairs. All right, so we win World War II. Go us, right? But the Soviet Union also wins World War II. And the U.S. and the Soviet Union don't really have anything in common. We were only allies in World War II because we had a common enemy, which was Nazi Germany. Now we no longer have that, then we're going to be enemies again. And we have new technology, both of us do now, nuclear technology. We can launch one state can launch a nuclear strike on another, and within 20 minutes of it being launched, nuclear Armageddon. As a result of this, we need someone who can make split-second decisions. If we receive word that a nuclear strike has been launched, we don't have time to go to Congress and have them pass a bill allowing for a response. We need someone who can make a split-second decision on how to handle this. And of course, that's going to be the president. So this has led the president to gain more power. Also, foreign affairs. When the Constitution was written in 1787, U.S. foreign policy was much less significant than it is now. Now, foreign policy is probably as important as domestic policy. So one of the reasons probably the founders gave the president such latitude on foreign policy was because it didn't amount to much in 1790. Today, it amounts to a whole lot more. If they were writing the Constitution today, would they have given the president so much authority for foreign policy? I don't know. My guess is probably not, but they didn't write today. They wrote it 230 years ago. The New Deal, domestic affairs, has created a more activist presidency. I mentioned this before, but in 1893 there was a depression, and Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, basically said, look, I'm sorry, I know it sucks out there, but don't look to the federal government for help because it's not the federal government's job. And Cleveland vetoed, I think he may have the record for most vetoes of any president. He vetoed all kinds of bills that would have provided relief or aid to people that were affected by the economic downturn. But it's hard to imagine a president today saying that. If there's an economic crash, hopefully there's not, but let's say there was an economic crash tomorrow, do you think President Trump would go on TV and say, not the federal government's job to address this? Well, if he did that, he could probably forget about winning in 2020, right? So we expect a whole lot more from the president and from the government today than we did in Cleveland's day. Also, the mass media magnify the president too. We all feel like we know the president. We don't, but we feel like we do. What we know of any president is a carefully managed public persona. We don't actually know these people. We don't know Trump. We don't know Obama. We don't know Bush. We don't know Clinton, but we feel like we do. And this increased power of the presidency in the 20th century has led some people to refer to the current situation with the president, not Trump specifically, but say post-World War II, so all presidents post-World War II, as the imperial presidency. This was a term coined by Arthur Schlesinger, which basically says the president has become much more powerful than what the founders intended. All right, so the president also has some informal tools. The president, the chief actor on the Washington stage. When the president speaks, everyone listens. Whatever the president wants to talk about immediately gets put on the agenda. The president can gain instant control over news media. Just request network airtime, go on TV and give a speech. Or today, just post something, just tweet something. And suddenly, everybody's talking about it. TV and the internet can be used to address Americans, or if you're more cynical, manipulate Americans. Kitchen cabinet, what's this? This was a term coined during the Andrew Jackson administration to refer to basically friends of the president, or people that the president listens to. People who don't have formal positions in government, but just people that are influential with the president. So, president talking about issues with their buddies on the weekend. His buddy might say, hey, I really think you should do blah, blah, blah. If the president ends up doing that, then that would be how the kitchen cabinet works. All right, powers and limits of the presidency. President is commander-in-chief of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Reserve, and National Guard units. The president, though, is not a member of the military. He is a civilian. This is the concept of civilian supremacy. You probably also know that although the president is commander-in-chief, it is ultimately Congress who has the authority to declare war. It's also Congress that ultimately appropriates money to pay for conflicts. So Congress does have some war-making powers here, although we tend to, these days, think of it as much more of a role for the president. One of the greatest powers the president has, and one of the few, perhaps the only, there may be a few others, but the most significant, probably the most significant one that is unreviewable, is the power to pardon. So the president has the power to pardon anyone convicted of a federal crime, not a state crime. State crimes are outside the president's authority to pardon. But anybody convicted or even accused of a federal crime can be pardoned by the president. And if the president pardons you, it's as though the crime never happened. If you're in prison at the time the pardon is issued, the paperwork is submitted to the warden when it's immediately upon the pardon being issued. The warden goes to your jail cell, takes you out, and you walk out immediately. So, and there's nothing that can ever be done to review this. This is one of the only powers of the president that's completely unreviewable. Again, if you're pardoned, the crime is stricken from the record. Basically, it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. And you can pardon someone not only for crimes they've been convicted of, but crimes they've been charged with, or even crimes they may or may not have committed. Gerald Ford issued a full pardon for Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed during Watergate. Nixon at the time had not been charged with anything. So then he could never be charged with any of those crimes. So this is a really powerful thing the president has. Bush, during his presidency, issued 189 pardons. Clinton issued 140. Governors, I should mention this is worth mentioning, governors, typically in Tennessee this is the case, have the power to pardon those convicted of state crimes. And there's sort of a fun / depressing story about a Tennessee governor named Ray Blanton, who, towards the end of his last week or so of his administration, decided he could make some money selling pardons. I mean, there's a lot of people in prison in Tennessee. You think, how much, if you were in prison, how much would you pay to walk out of prison immediately, free person? probably any money you have. So he literally started selling pardons. And he pardoned one guy who had murdered his own family. So, well, I should specify that the guy he pardoned had murdered his own family, not the governor's family, but the prisoner had murdered the prisoner's wife. I think it was actually his wife, not his whole family, but just his wife, which doesn't make it any better, obviously. So he ended up going to prison, by the way, Blanton did, because that's bribery. But the people he pardoned, it's unreviewable. They're free. So you could actually literally buy a pardon, and it's still valid. Now, you can get charged with bribery, of course, but how long do you go to prison for bribery? A couple years. If you're in there for murder, you're probably in there for the rest of your life. So, sure, who's not going to trade a life sentence for 3 years? So pardoning is one of the greatest powers the president has, and it's a check on government. It's there. It's designed to ensure that, so like people do get wrongly convicted of crimes, or sometimes people commit crimes that make sense or are justifiable in the context of which they're committed. I mean, this is kind of a goofy example, but like if you're run a red light because you're rushing someone to the hospital, then you've technically broken the law, but any reasonable person looking at that's going to say, okay, yeah, you broke the law, but you had a justifiable reason for doing it, so we're not going to punish you for it. So that's what pardons are. Presidents also have the power to grant clemency. Clemency means that the crime you were convicted of remains on the books, but your sentence is reduced. So, for example, if someone was convicted of marijuana possession and got sentenced to 50 years in prison, most people, reasonable people, would say, yeah, that's a little extreme. So, the president could commute that sentence down to, say, 6 months. Then you would only serve 6 months. But the conviction remains on the books. You do remain a felon. It's just that your sentence is shortened. And Obama actually commuted the sentences of a lot of drug offenders who had committed drug crimes, but non-violent crimes. So again, those convictions remain on the books, but their sentences were reduced. The ultimate check on I didn't talk about this. Treaties and recognitions of foreign nations. I think we've talked about that. The president appoints judicial nominees. They have to be confirmed by the Senate, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Supreme Court pretty soon. President can veto legislation passed by Congress. Of course, Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote of each chamber. And the president gives the annual State of the Union address. All right, now we got to talk about the ultimate check on presidential power, and that's going to be impeachment. Presidents can be impeached. Supreme Court justices can be impeached. Any federal official can be impeached. But since we're talking about the presidency, we'll talk about the presidents here. There's only been 2 presidents in all of American history who have been impeached, and that would be Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Andrew Johnson in 1868, I believe, and Clinton in 1998. No president has ever been removed from office through impeachment, though. So, being impeached does not mean you get automatically removed from office. An impeachment trial impeachment proceedings work like this. If there is evidence the president is guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, which is the standard laid out in the Constitution, then the House of Representatives investigates. And if they find sufficient evidence to warrant a trial, then they draft articles of impeachment, and if a majority of the House votes in favor of them, then the president or other federal official is impeached. But that's only phase 1. Phase 2 is the Senate. The Senate holds a trial. And it works pretty much like a normal trial. If the president's being impeached, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court comes and presides over the proceedings. Typically, the vice president does, but that's a little bit of a conflict of interest since the VP becomes president, should the president become removed from office. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the proceedings and works more or less like a typical trial. You have a prosecutor, you have defense attorneys, each side presents evidence, each side brings in witnesses and questions witnesses. Each side presents their case. At the end of the proceedings, the Senate votes on whether or not to convict. And if 2/3 vote to convict, then the president is removed from office. If fewer than 2/3 vote to convict, the president is acquitted and remains in office. Nixon probably would have been impeached and probably would have been removed from office if he had not resigned before this could happen. So impeachment is pretty rare that it happens. So we talked about this. Presidential powers have greatly expanded over time. Partly this is because of the take care clause in the Constitution, which requires the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. President can issue directives. These are executive orders, proclamations, military orders. These have been more used in recent history, especially when Congress is controlled by one party and the president is of a different party, or because Congress just can't get much done. But executive orders, actually, the authority for these come from Congress. President has the authority to issue executive orders only because Congress has passed legislation empowering the president in areas where he issues executive orders. So, for example, the president theoretically could issue an executive order today which required every car in the United States to get 50 miles to the gallon of gasoline. President didn't naturally have this authority, though. Congress, when they created the Department of Transportation, gave the president authority over transportation, and thus, as a result, he has the power to issue this executive order. So, this is power that Congress has ceded to the president. Now, if the president were to... Now, executive orders are not unreviewable. If the president passed an executive order like that, I would imagine Congress would immediately pass a law overruling executive order. A law will overrule an executive order. Also, the courts can strike down executive orders as unconstitutional as well. So, presidents have a lot of power when it comes to executive orders, but most of it actually originates from Congress. President can issue military orders as well. This goes back to being commander-in-chief of the military. President has what's called the bully pulpit. This was a term that was coined by Teddy Theodore Roosevelt, and the idea here in his day, of course, bully has a negative connotation today, but at the time, bully meant good. And this refers to the president's ability to persuade. The president can set the agenda too, gives a speech about a policy, or tweets about it. Immediately, everybody's talking about it. All right, wartime. The football must remain near the president at all times. It's in the room he sleeps in at night. What is the football? It contains the authorization codes for launch of nuclear missiles. And so the president can never be separated from this. Scary? Probably. There it is. There it is, somebody carrying it. Yikes. President usually delegates authority in terms for the military to generals and admirals. He isn't really required to do so. We talked about this already, but civilian control of the military. I put MacArthur in parentheses here because MacArthur was a World War II general hero. He later oversaw the Korean War, and he disagreed with Truman's strategy for the Korean War. He wanted to march on into China and take out China. Truman didn't want to do that, so MacArthur started feeding information to Truman's enemies in Congress. Truman responded by firing him. At the time, this was unpopular because, again, MacArthur was a national hero. Today, most people would say that Truman was probably right. MacArthur was trying to take power away from the presidency, and the concept is that we have a system of civilian supremacy. Congress has power to declare war. President, of course, can send troops into harm's way or into battle zones, but if he does that, he's required to report to Congress within 48 hours of doing so. And congressional approval is needed to keep troops deployed abroad for more than 60 days. However, here's some interesting questions. The War Powers Resolution was written in the 1970s. Today, things have changed a lot. Does this include, say, airstrikes. So if the president orders airstrikes against, say, Syria, is he required to report to Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into combat? Both Obama and Trump have not. Or what if we don't send troops at all, but we use drones? So humans don't actually literally go into combat at all. Is the president required to report to Congress in 48 hours of that? They have not. But this is an example of the law not keeping up with the technology. When the War Powers Resolution was written, drones were the stuff of science fiction. What we really should do is amend the War Powers Resolution and War Powers Act and to cover drones and either say drones are included, in other words, the president has to report within 48 hours, or they're not, which means the president doesn't. But we haven't done that, and so that's a pretty big gray area right now. As it is, the presidents have not been required to report to Congress in 48 hours. The congressional approval to keep troops deployed abroad for more than 60 days, this remains in effect, although I don't think any Congress has ever refused to pass this approval, because that would be a really radical step. A war would have to be, I think, super unpopular before Congress would invoke that, like maybe 10% approval or something, because it looks like you're cutting off, well, actually you would be cutting off funds for troops in harm's way. So that's not something that Congress is going to do unless they are forced to. Judiciary, Congress, the president has struggled with judiciary, civil liberties especially. Sort of recent cases involving this is, should terrorist detainees receive Geneva Conventions protections? If you don't know, the Geneva Conventions are a series of international agreements the United States is a signatory to, which means we're supposed to follow them, which govern how warfare should be conducted in a civilized way and governs how POWs, prisoners of war, should be treated. What's the thing about terrorist organizations and fighters for terrorist organizations is they are not technically soldiers because they are not fighting for a state. So, are they entitled to Geneva Conventions protections? Well, the letter of the law says no, but again, this is ambiguous because the law hasn't kept up with the reality. If we were writing them today, would we write them to include terrorist suspects, terrorist detainees? Maybe. We don't know. Again, the correct thing to do here would be to reconvene in Geneva and amend them to cover this, but we don't because we like gray areas. And this gives the president more power here. Executive Office of the President. It's consists of several key organizations reporting to the President. The White House Office. This is the President's personal staff. The Office of Management and Budget, which oversees federal budget and federal regulations, which Trump has actually called for to be abolished. We'll see if that happens. The National Security Council, the NSC, they advise the president on national security issues. The Council of Economic Advisors, also what it sounds like, they advise the president on the economy. The Chief of Staff, this is the person who oversees interactions among the president and his personal staff and cabinet secretaries. This was a position that was started by Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, had been a general, and he had liked the position of Army Chief of Staff, so he created a position modeled after that for the president, and it's worked pretty well since then. We should mention the Office of the Vice President. What does the Vice President actually do? Well, the answer is not a whole lot. The first Vice President was John Adams, and he said of the Vice Presidency, quote, "My country in its wisdom has contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the imagination of man contrived or his imagination conceived." John Garner Nance, who was one of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents, was a little bit more blunt. He said the vice presidency is, quote, "not worth a bucket of warm spit." He probably didn't say spit. The newspapers probably sanitized that. So, per the Constitution, the vice president becomes president should the president die, be removed from office, resign, or become incapacitated. The vice president is president of the Senate, but can only break ties in the Senate. So, as a result of this, the vice president can preside over the Senate, but has no real power unless there's a tie vote, which means the vice president rarely shows up to the Senate. They only do if they think there's going to be a tie. Ultimately, the vice president doesn't do much. They get to live in the Naval Observatory, which must be pretty cool, but the vice presidency, though, can be a stepping stone to the presidency. And presidents usually choose running mates or vice presidents based to address some weakness or some concern in their own resume. So, for example, Trump chose Mike Pence to be his running mate. Mike Pence was a former governor of Indiana, someone who had extensive political experience. Trump did not. He was an outsider, so outsider chooses an insider to balance out his ticket. Or Barack Obama chose Joe Biden in 2008 to be his running mate. Obama was young. Joe Biden was much older, and Biden had foreign policy experience, which Obama didn't have. So again, to balance out a potential concern here. The actual power of the vice presidency varies from VP to VP. It really just comes down to what kind of relationship they have with the president. If there's somebody the president respects and trusts, then they'll have influence over the president. Dick Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president, was a very powerful one. I think Biden was probably fairly powerful too, and Pence, it's harder to say. I suspect he is fairly powerful, though, as well. Then there's the office of the First Lady, which is not an official post. There's no official power associated with it, but it's a ceremonial position. And sort of the model for First Ladies historically have been Dolly Madison, who was the wife of James Madison. She was very charming, socialite, hosted like dinner parties and stuff among Washington. Of course, the ideas of what the First Lady should do have shifted as views on women's roles have also changed. Some First Ladies are more public than others. Typically, in recent years, First Ladies have been expected to choose an issue which they advocate on. Melania Trump, for instance, has chosen bullying as her issue, and she has given speeches and spoken publicly out against bullying. Michelle Obama chose childhood obesity, so she pushed for more exercise, better food for kids. Laura Bush was childhood literacy, so she pushed for kids to read more. Nancy Reagan was anti-drug. She did the Just Say No Club, just say no to drugs and alcohol. I remember in elementary school, that was all the rage. They had the Just Say No Club and all that. Some First Ladies are more public than others. Just some people enjoy public spotlight, and some people don't. I think I would say the last three actually have more or less shied away from the spotlight. I don't think Melania Trump or Michelle Obama or Laura Bush particularly enjoy being in the spotlight. I think Hillary Clinton was a much more public First Lady. And Barbara Bush was too, I think, to some extent. Usually, though, First Ladies are more popular than their husbands. This isn't really surprising, though. I mean, they don't have to take positions on controversial or divisive issues. They just take positions on things that pretty much everyone can agree on. I mean, anti-bullying, pro-reading, pro-fitness and nutrition, anti-drugs. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who thinks kids should do drugs, eat junk food, lay around, not read, and bully other kids. I mean, if you think that, then you're probably a terrible person. So, I mean, these are stuff, typically they advocate on stuff that nobody's really going to disagree with. So that's one reason they're typically more popular than the president. All right, so we talked about the pre-20th century presidencies that are significant, I think. Let's talk about some that have been significant in the 20th century. One is going to be Franklin Roosevelt. He's not the first president to take more powers than are outlined in the Constitution, but he oversaw kind of a political realignment and a shift in public perception of what the role of the president and the government is. He was elected in 1932 during the Great Depression, and his ran on a platform, a New Deal for the American people. We're going to get the economy moving again. We're going to create jobs and get people to work again. And through this, he created a number of New Deal programs. New programs are collectively known as the New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. Both of these organizations put Americans to work for the government. So the federal government's going to fund and pay for jobs in order to get people working again. We need infrastructure built, right? We need parks and roads and dams. So why don't we have a bunch of people unemployed. So why don't we put them to work for the government doing what we need done? And by the way, if you're not somebody that's into like work like that, like construction work or things like that, well, there's other opportunities too, right? I mean, you have a bunch of people working hard every day. They need to be entertained. So why don't we bring even actors and writers can come out and entertain them? Or we need people to keep records, so jobs for them too. We also will send people out to interview historical figures. Most of what we know about day-to-day life in slavery comes from a WPA program in which writers working for the federal government were sent out to interview former slaves, elderly slaves at this point. They'd been 70 years, more or less, since slavery had been abolished, so the last living slaves were still around, so we interviewed them. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the economy to prevent another crash from happening. The National Labor Relations Act was created to encourage unionization. And probably the most significant one is going to be Social Security is created. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is significant around here too. Roosevelt maintained public support through fireside chats, as he called them. He would go on the radio and speak directly to the public. First time most Americans had ever heard their president's voice before. And they felt like they knew the president. And this was sort of a master political stroke because it allowed him to connect with the public in ways previous presidents hadn't done. The Trump practice of tweeting is sort of, I guess you could say, a descendant of fireside chats. Of course, not everybody is thrilled about the federal government doing all this. You're putting people to work for the government. This is a huge expansion of federal power. Probably, or I would say definitely more than what the founders envisioned. Should we be worried about this? Maybe. And a minority of Americans were. The Supreme Court especially was. And they started striking down striking down New Deal programs. Like they struck down the National Labor Relations Act, for instance. And it looked like they were going to strike down Social Security too. Roosevelt then called for what's become known as the court packing plan. He said, hey, all these Supreme Court justices, they're old. It's unfair to require them to carry such a heavy workload in their golden years. So I'm going to do them a favor. I'm going to appoint a new justice for each current justice over the age of 69 years or older. And that's going to be 6 new justices, which is going to bring the Supreme Court total up to 15. And so I'll get to appoint 6 new justices. They'll combine with the 2 or 3 on the court that already agree with me, and suddenly that's a majority. Congress refused to go along with this, and ultimately it didn't happen. Because it was seen, and rightfully so, as an attack by the executive on judicial power. And ultimately, but nonetheless, 2 of Roosevelt's critics on the court saw the writing on the wall and they retired. So maybe that was Roosevelt's plan all along. Going forward, 1960s, Lyndon Johnson sort of had maybe a pro and also a negative impact on the presidency as well. He had a series of programs called the Great Society. This would include things like Medicare, Medicaid, Job Corps. These were programs that were seen as sort of an expansion of the New Deal. He also oversaw the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, signed them into law. So again, a more activist presidency, a more activist federal government. On the other hand, he also oversaw the Vietnam War, got us more and more involved in Vietnam, and couldn't figure out a way out, and actively lied to us about a lot of what was going on in Vietnam too, which we find out later. And holy smoke, it turns out the presidents may lie to us. I mean, it seems like obvious now, but this is one of those things where the genie's out of the bottle. If you'd taken a poll in 1960 and asked if you thought the government was looking out for your interests, probably 70% or more of Americans would say yes. Today, you're looking at less than a third. So the fact that we find out that the government lies to us has definitely increased cynicism towards the government. And of course, this has also been affected by the Watergate scandal. All right, so Richard Nixon was up for re-election in 1972. And Nixon is paranoid. It's really strange because Nixon won the 72 election by carrying 49 states. So, I mean, the outcome wasn't really in doubt. He was going to win if it's... There was a famous saying usually attributed to Talleyrand, who was a French foreign minister in the late 1700s, that a blunder is worse than a crime. In other words, some crimes can be understandable, but a blunder is not. Or put another way, why cheat if you're going to win anyway? If you cheat when you're going to win anyway, then you're more likely to get caught cheating and lose office that way than if you just run, like, it's not in your interest to cheat at that point. But anyway, so a group of people who work for the Nixon administration, or for, not the administration, but for his re-election campaign, which had the Committee to Re-elect the President, which has the worst acronym in human history, CREEP, broke into the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. They broke in because that was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. They were trying to plant listening devices in there to listen in, and they were looking for dirt on the Democratic nominee that year, George McGovern. And they got caught. They were called plumbers because their job was to find leaks in the campaign. Get it? At the time, and of course Forrest Gump happened to be staying at the room across the way from them and saw them and called security and reported it. Not really, but you saw the movie. So, at the time they got caught, they got arrested. It was treated mostly as a simple crime story. Looked like it was going to blow over. But two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who worked for the Washington Post, pursued this story and determined that these burglars actually had ties to people way up high in the Nixon campaign and in the Nixon administration. 5 defendants pleaded guilty to breaking in and went to prison. We also learned through this that Nixon kept an enemies list. Here's free advice. Don't write down a list of your enemies because that just looks demented, especially if you're president. I mean, how would you like to be on the president's enemies list? Also allowed spying on U.S. citizens who were deemed security threats, which typically translated as people I don't like. We later learned too that Nixon had kept a recording device in the Oval Office and recorded all conversations there. Why did he do it? Because A, he was paranoid. He was probably trying to keep this so he'd have a record of everything that was said to him, so thought he could maybe use it as dirt on people he talked to. But of course, it ended up backfiring horribly on him. When it came out that he had these tapes, he claimed the Congress immediately demanded that he turn them over. He claimed executive privilege and tried not to, but ultimately courts ruled that he had to, so he turned them over, except for one, which has 18 minutes erased. And what was on those 18 minutes? We don't know. Probably about the aliens at Area 51 would be my guess. If you can't tell, I'm joking. Probably something super incriminating would be my guess, but we don't know. Maybe someday technology will allow us to recover that. And they proved that Nixon had lied about the cover-up. Did he know about it ahead of time? We don't know. We do know that when he found out about it, he lied about it and covered it up. And some people have said, well, if Nixon had just, if he didn't know, assuming he didn't know about it beforehand, if he had just come clean when he found out about it and said, yes, some people working for our campaign broke into the Watergate Hotel, we do not condone this, I'm ordering a full investigation, and we're going to punish those responsible to the fullest extent of the law, he would have survived this. He probably would have, except that assumes he did nothing else wrong. The reality was that whether or not he knew about this is questionable, but they did actually authorize people working for his campaign to break into the psychiatrist office who was treating Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. So probably these burglars knew too much to be thrown to the wolves. In other words, if he had done that and prosecuted them, they would have said, all right, Nixon may not have known about this, but I have proof that he knew about this, this, and this, which would have gotten him into more trouble. So his only real hope was to deny, and hope that nobody finds a smoking gun. But unfortunately for him, they did. And, of course, the tapes also reflected badly on Nixon. He's on tape making anti-Semitic comments, for example, uses harsh language, dropped curses like a sailor. Paints him in addition to the crimes, also paints him in a very unflattering light. And his approval rating collapsed, and in August of 1974, he resigned, the only president ever to do so, in lieu of being impeached. And as a result of that, suddenly Americans realize, hey, presidents lie to us, the government lies to us. Politicians are not always nice people. And I think you can trace a lot of this cynicism and negativity people feel towards the government back to this event. And on some level, this is good, by the way. I mean, we should always remember that politicians are just people like us. Some are good, some are bad, most are somewhere in between. But on the other hand, I think we've probably gotten a little too cynical about it as well. All right, so after Nixon, we get Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Both are honest men, good people, not very effective presidents, though. In 1980, Reagan runs for president and is elected in a landslide. He argues for sort of a limited government, lower taxes, cuts in domestic spending, coupled with an aggressive foreign policy, take it to the Soviet Union. 1980s, the economy is good, beginning in about 83, and he reflected the conservatism and optimism of the 1980s. And, of course, the platform he ran on is still pretty much the Republican platform today. All right, and that is going to do it for today. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next time. Have a good day.